Okay, welcome everyone. I've done this class for I think almost 25 years. I recently found a memo that I wrote to Rabbi Wexler in I think it was late 1999, in which I proposed that I teach a class, and he had encouraged me to do that, and I outlined what I had in mind, and I've been doing it every year since. So we are certainly approaching 25 years, I believe, which is even longer than I had thought it was. But this year is particularly special to me, and I'll explain why. We're going to focus on the life and learning of David Weiss Halivni, who was, without a doubt, one of the giants of Torah of the 20th century, really of the entire modern period, I would say. One of the greatest Jewish scholars of Talmudic literature, of rabbinic literature more generally, and of Jewish theology, as I'll explain. And his life, his really poignant and extremely impactful life, really encompassed, and he himself embodied many of the important events, themes, and issues of the 20th century. He died last year in Israel after making Aliyah about 15 or so years earlier. I'll get back to his biography, but I usually start with a very short biography of myself. But this year that is particularly relevant. As most of you know, I've been a lawyer for many years, but before I was a lawyer, I did 6 years of graduate study, post-college study in Jewish studies, spent a year at Hebrew University in Israel, and then I did 5 years at Columbia as a PhD student in the religion department under Professor Halivni's supervision and tutelage. So I have a very strong personal connection to Professor Halivni. I studied with him for 5 years. I was his teaching assistant for 3 of those years, in which I helped him prepare the sort of second phase of one of his English books, Pshat and Drash. We'll get back to that. And I helped him prepare a couple of his English language articles. I'm saying English language because his magnum opus, which we'll discuss, in Hebrew, Mekorot u'Mesorot, sources and traditions, was written in Hebrew. So at a certain point in his career, he started to venture into English, which, as I'll explain, was probably his 4th or 5th language. And I helped him convey his ideas in English during my tenure as his teaching assistant. So this class really has a strong personal connection for me. I mentioned a few weeks ago, for those of you who were there at the celebration of Rabbi Wexler's 80th birthday, that Rabbi Wexler was one of the most important formative influences in my adult life. Putting aside my family, Rabbi Wexler really played a very important role in my adult life. And without a doubt, as I noted earlier about Halivni's stature, he also was one of the most important influences in my life. I feel honored and privileged and emotionally touched to be able to try to convey to you the import of his scholarship, of his thinking, of the impact that he had on Jewish life in the 20th century. A number of years ago, if some of you, I think, attended one of these classes, I dedicated to the thought of Yosef Yerushalmi, who was also one of my professors at Columbia, the great historian, the great Jewish historian of the 20th century, perhaps the greatest of the century. And he and Halivni were colleagues at Columbia. I was closer to Halivni. Yerushalmi was in the history department. I was in the religion department, and Professor Halivni was the primary Jewish studies professor in the religion department, and I was his teaching assistant, but feel privileged to have both of them as my teachers. So I'm very happy to try to give you a sense of the import of Professor Halivni's life and legacy. And I do it in his blessed memory. He died just a few months ago last year, and the Jewish world is really is really lessened by his passing. So with those prefatory comments, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we'll go through the text in my source sheet, in which I'll try to convey to you the impact and significance of his life and learning. Okay. I hope you can now see my source sheet. I've entitled it "A Certain Amount of Harmony," and that's a quotation, as we'll see, from his memoir, The Life and Learning of David Weiss Halivni, and I've entitled this session "Tension of Sources and Traditions." That's somewhat of a play of words based on his great work, Mekorot Sorot, Sources and Traditions, which again was written in Hebrew, an important introduction to that multi-volume Talmudic commentary. Was translated by one of his students, and we'll get to that soon, hopefully today. But let me give you a little bit of introduction as to what I mean by tension. I say there's a certain amount of harmony. That implies that it's a harmony that is resolving or reconciling some source of tension in Halivni's life. And I want to give you a sense of that. We'll be coming back to all of this. This is just to introduce the topic, but I want to give you a sense of what I mean by tension and potential harmony. The first text here is from The Book and the Sword. This is his very succinct and readable memoir, The Book and the Sword, A Life of Learning in the Shadow of Destruction. Let me give you just we'll get back to this in just a few minutes, but a very quick outline of his biography. He was born in what was then Czechoslovakia, what is now Ukraine, in a small town, really in a broken home. His parents split up when he was quite young. He was born into what we today would call an ultra-Orthodox family, but back then it was just a very religious, devout, pious family, except his father wasn't so pious. And he writes about this in his memoir. His parents divorced. His mother sent him to live with his Hasidic rabbi grandfather in Sighet in Romania. And that's really where he grew up. From a very young age, he was a childhood friend, and he remained a lifelong friend of Elie Wiesel. The two of them were very close and grew up together, and were friends until Elie Wiesel's passing. Halivni had difficult circumstances growing up. His sister had physical difficulties. The family did not have money. He was very early on recognized as what was called in the traditional Jewish community an Ilui, a prodigy, at a very young age, and we'll get back to that. We'll see how that translated into his showing his Jewish knowledge. He was recognized early on as a Talmudic scholar. He received rabbinic ordination. Again, all of this is Orthodox. Received Orthodox rabbinic ordination at the age of 15. But soon after that, a couple of years later, the world changed. His world was shattered by the arrival of the Nazis on the doorstep of his hometown. The Nazis overran his area. He was taken to Auschwitz, where his entire family, at Auschwitz and other places, his entire family was killed. So they were all murdered by the Nazis. Halivni was the only survivor of his family. He spent time at Auschwitz and at two other labor camps. And we'll get back to this, but he managed to survive the ordeal and the trauma. His memoir, as you can see, The Book and the Sword, A Life of Learning in the Shadow of Destruction, is about his attachment to Jewishness, to Judaism, to Jewish learning, before, during, and after and despite the Holocaust. He arrived in the United States as, I think, a 17 or 18-year-old orphan. He was sent to a Jewish orphanage. Um, his rabbinic genius was soon recognized. He was sent to a yeshiva, the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva, again, an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva in Brooklyn. But he had a desire to learn secular subjects, and he concurrently then spent time at the yeshiva while also pursuing, he had to learn English. He didn't know English. So again, that, at least the following languages came in ahead of English for him: Yiddish, Aramaic, and Hebrew. All of those, at least. I don't know if he knew other European languages. He probably knew some German, maybe some Romanian. I don't even know what other languages he might have had access to. But he had to learn English when he got here. He completed high school, went to Brooklyn College, finished his college education in a couple of years, got a master's degree in secular philosophy at NYU, and then was introduced to Professor Saul Lieberman at JTS, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative rabbinical school, came back to get his PhD in Talmud at JTS, and then was a professor at JTS for many years until following the controversial decision to ordain female rabbis, and we'll get back to his role in that. He came to Columbia, and that's really where I encountered him. He had been at Columbia, I think he had just recently arrived there when I started my PhD program, and then eventually became his teaching assistant. I arrived in 1986. I think he may have arrived the year before. And just so you have a context for all of this, Joanne and I found Or Zarua in 1990. So Or Zarua was established in late 1989. Joanne and I found Or Zarua just a few months later after weekly Shabbat services had started. We were married a year later after we found Or Zarua in early 1991. We were married by Rabbi Wexler, and Rabbi Haskell Lookstein also officiated. And we were blessed to have Professor Halivni give a Devar Torah at our wedding. I saw that Diane, and I don't know if Aaron is on as well, but I believe they were at our wedding. And Professor Halivni gave the Devar Torah.
We were there.
Good, good. So I don't know if you remember Professor Halivni, but he gave a Devar Torah there. So we have a very long-standing, very personal connection to him. So let me give you a sense. We'll get back to his biography in just a moment. But I want to introduce this issue of why I'm calling this class a certain amount of harmony. I want to try to identify the sources of tension in his life. He writes about it in his memoir and in the writings that he and I worked on, or that I worked on with him during my graduate program. He writes in his memoir, how can one reconcile the two? I've added these numbers just so that it's clearer for you. The critical study, the intellectual perception of a text, and two, the adherence to strict halachic observance, believing in the divinity of the text. By the way, he remained a strictly observant Jew until the end of his life. This is a subject I try to deal with in the last chapter of my book, Pshat and Drash, Plain and Applied Meaning in Rabbinic Exegesis. That's this book here that I worked on with him. He graciously mentions me in the acknowledgments to that book, and in another book dealing with classical Jewish hermeneutics. However, my position, which is epitomized by my leaving the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva because it was intellectually stifling, he's referring to the yeshiva in Brooklyn, and really his entire education until he got to the United States, which was just immersive in terms of rabbinic literature. He had interests in secular subjects and in asking questions about rabbinic literature that were not welcome in the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. So on the one hand, he felt intellectually stifled in that yeshiva world, and later leaving JTS because it was religiously wanting. And that refers to his perception that the halachic decision-making process at JTS had become deficient. Again, we'll return to that issue. So he's saying that his position of being intellectually sort of curious, but also religiously committed, is apparently difficult to follow. I seem to live with this combination in a certain amount of harmony. So again, it's caveated. He's saying only a certain amount of harmony, and that's why I chose this for my title. I don't think he ever fully felt that his life embodied a perfectly harmonious reconciliation of the tension, the sources of tension that he felt. But he was a very sort of, despite his background, his difficult background, and his enduring the ordeal of and trauma of the Holocaust, he was always a very upbeat man, very cheery guy. So he was generally, I think, a happy man. He took great satisfaction and fulfillment and a sense of love from his study of Torah. But I don't think he felt perfectly at home because of these sources of tension that we'll discuss. Will others follow suit, meaning follow his model and the theological paradigm that he offers that we'll get into? I often wonder whether I will succeed in transmitting this position to future generations, or whether it is not unique to my own particular intense Jewish background, and people who do not share my background will experience tension that they will not be able to withstand. They will tend to follow either the religious side, and by that he means the commitment to Jewish tradition and Jewish law, or the intellectual scholarly side, but not both. He was preoccupied by trying to leave a legacy for others, and I think he had a certain amount of trepidation that his model, his paradigm, would not be easy for other people to follow, and he may have been right about that. We'll get back to it. And he continues. This is another excerpt from his really, again, very short but highly readable memoir that I strongly recommend to you. He writes there, "It is my personal tragedy that the people I daven, I pray with, I cannot talk to, and the people I talk to, I cannot daven with." And by that he means the people he davens with are those he feels religious affiliation, spiritual affiliation with, but he really can't necessarily talk to them about his scholarly interest, because his scholarly conclusions were often quite radical and non-traditional. And the people I talk to, meaning his scholarly colleagues, I cannot daven with. However, when the chips are down, I will always side with the people I daven with, for I can live without talking. I cannot live without davening. And I think that's a very poignant way to capture it. We often have, all of us have, in a certain sense, bifurcated lives in various respects. And Halivni is saying, if he had to choose, he would align himself with the people that he davens with, as opposed to the people he can engage in scholarly conversation with. This same tension between his intellectual scholarly life on the one hand and his religious, spiritual, halachic life on the other, I think has been felt by a lot of other committed traditional Jews, including many Orthodox rabbis. And I wanted to give you just one example. This is from Rabbi Mordechai Breuer, who's a very well-known and influential Orthodox biblical scholar of the 20th century. This is from one of his essays. And he wrote there, "The topic assigned to me implies a possible contradiction between the," and again, these numbers I've added, "the modern critical study of Bible," and he means modern critical biblical scholarship that is inconsistent with the traditional notions of how the Torah was revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. We'll get back to that. So between a contradiction between modern biblical scholarship about the Torah and Yirat Shamayim, the traditional fear of God, the fear of heaven. The God-fearing student of the Bible must confront this presumed contradiction and seek to resolve it. Failing to do so, his scholarly wisdom will take precedence over his piety. So Rabbi Breuer doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want a traditional Jew's piety to be his commitment to, his or her commitment to tradition and to halakha, to Jewish law, to be dropped. Even worse, Rabbi Breuer writes, as the result of psychological conflict, the critical scholar in him will undermine his piety, and as one who is God-fearing, he will reject his own scholarship. So Rabbi Breuer, like Professor Halivni, feared that these two aspects of a modern committed Jew's life, on the one hand, sort of intellectual curiosity and scholarly pursuits about the historical development of Judaism, would be in conflict, in severe tension with a traditional Jew's commitment to a Jewish way of life, to halakha, to the entire Jewish legal system. And Halivni and Breuer did not want that tension to cause traditional Jews to lose their faith. It's a parallel concern and anxiety and angst in this contemporary period to what Maimonides felt in the medieval period. That's why Maimonides wrote the Guide of the Perplexed. He wanted to ease the anxiety, the tension that sophisticated Jews of his time were feeling about the conflict, the incompatibility between philosophy of the time, scholarship of the time, on the one hand, and on the other hand, their commitment to Jewish tradition and Jewish law. Let me make it more clear about what Halivni, and by the way, he was a rabbi, as I mentioned, he was ordained at age 15, but I refer to him, I've never referred to him in my interactions with him as Rabbi Halivni. I always refer to him as either Professor Halivni or more usually as Dr. Halivni. So I'm going to refer to him with both of those terms, either Professor or Dr. Halivni. Wrote in this essay, Chatzui Yisrael, a possible solution to the conflict of Pshat and Drash. This is an article that I worked on with him. And here he refers specifically to one of the sources of the tension that he felt. He's best known for his Talmudic scholarship. We will return to that. What was it about his novel and quite groundbreaking Talmudic scholarship? What was it about that scholarship that caused him to feel tension? We'll get back to that. But when I was working with him, he was very focused on the interaction of rabbinic literature and the Torah. And he felt he was agitated by what he called the conflict of Pshat and Drash, which was the subject of the book Pshat and Drash that he wrote and that I worked on with him. But in this English article, he wrote, a well-documented and often scrutinized feature of rabbinic exegesis is its occasional deviation from the Pshat, when he uses the Latin or sensus literalis of a scriptural phrase or verse. So the plain contextual meaning, when you read the verse, what does it seem to be trying to convey? And Professor Halivni was a big believer that Jewish texts, really any kind of text, but in his life, he was preoccupied with Jewish texts. A text really should be taken to mean what it says, unless it is intended to be understood figuratively or poetically. He was very committed, as we'll see, he mentions in his biography, he was very committed to the Pshat sense of any Jewish text, whether it was in the Torah or in the Talmud. The Pshat, I'm going to continue reading, the Pshat, or the strict philological and syntactical meaning of a verse, is in certain instances forsaken by the rabbis in their attempt to tighten the link between practical halakha, so between Jewish law, and its scriptural biblical foundation. This discrepancy between Pshat and Drash, between the plain meaning of a verse that is dictated by content and context, and rabbinic exegesis that sometimes seems only loosely connected to the text, has been troubling to readers within and without the tradition. This problematic phenomenon of rabbinic literature has itself generated a steady stream of commentary of different sorts. And he explains, why is this a problem for the committed Jew? This sometimes idiosyncratic nature of rabbinic exegesis, and exegesis is a fancy word for interpretation of a prior text. And he means by idiosyncratic that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the rabbinic interpretation, the rabbinic drash or midrash of a Torah verse seems a bit artificial, seems disconnected from the plain meaning of the Torah verse, seems far-fetched, and it could be creative. But Halivni was bothered by the gap between the plain sense and the rabbinic interpretation in certain circumstances. So he says this sometimes idiosyncratic nature of rabbinic exegesis is, for the halakhically committed Jew, no mere trivial or scholastic issue, for it impinges on the basic question of the validity and authority of tradition as forged and formulated through rabbinic midrash. The issue of the dichotomy of pshat and drash is particularly relevant to the modern reader of the Bible. The modern exegetical sensibility has embraced the primacy of pshat, the primacy of the simple, plain, contextual meaning. By the way, it doesn't necessarily mean the literal meaning. The pshat of a verse could be derived through understanding the context of the verse. It doesn't necessarily mean the literal meaning, but it's the contextual meaning. And the modern scholar has embraced pshat, the simple meaning, over drash, the sort of more imaginative, creative interpretations of verses. Midrashic interpretation that seems unfettered by the plain, straightforward meaning of scripture can be judged exegetically capricious and textually groundless. Needless to say, again, he's writing from the perspective of a committed traditional Jew, committed to the Jewish legal system. Needless to say, such a judgment of rabbinic exegesis must be theologically unsettling to the Jew committed to the authority of traditional halachic interpretation. An attempt must therefore be made to diffuse the religious tension that is produced upon an awareness of the occasional discrepancy between the scriptural, it's a typo, I left out an R, scriptural, meaning the Torah pshat, the plain sense of the Torah verse, and rabbinic drash, the interpretation of the rabbis later in time. The problem of the occasional disparity between pshat and drash thus constitutes a weighty theological issue, for it creates avenues for imputing either imperfection to the divine text, meaning the text of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that we read in shul, in synagogues. Traditional Jews believe that it was divinely revealed. So this tension, this disparity between pshat and drash, can create avenues for imputing either imperfection to the Torah, to the divine text, or illegitimacy to traditional interpretation. And what he means is, if you have a plain sense of a Torah text, meaning A, and the rabbis interpret it to mean B, it seems to imply that either the divine text of the Torah is somehow defective and in need of repair or emendation by the rabbis, and that's not a good result. That's not a good outcome, because it implies that the divine Torah, the authoritative, our most authoritative text in our tradition, is somehow itself deficient. Or if you think, no, the rabbis are the ones who strayed from the plain sense of the text and engaged in interpretation that was unwarranted, then the rabbinic tradition is subject to the accusation, to the charge of being illegitimate and not sufficiently connected to the Torah. So it is that tension that really spurred him to create a theology that he proposed would help resolve that tension. And again, the title of the class is A Certain Amount of Harmony, based on that phrase from his own memoir. I think he thought his proposal went a certain way, but he wasn't certain that it fully resolved the gap. But that really was I believe, the motivating impetus in the sort of second part of his scholarly life, while he continued to write his magnum opus, his magisterial Talmudic commentary, Mekorot U'Mesorot, which is written in Hebrew, and it's really not accessible to the sort of lay Jewish reader. But his English language books that I worked on one of those with him and helped him write a couple of articles. He wanted to try to convey to traditional committed Jews who cared about the Jewish past and who cared about Jewish rituals and Jewish laws. He wanted to convey to them a potential solution to the problem that so bothered him. Okay, all of those comments were meant just to introduce the problem that Halivni was working on, that I'm going to focus on. His Talmudic commentary itself is frankly beyond the scope of this 3-class session. It really assumes a very high level of Talmudic knowledge. I will refer to it, and I'll try to convey to you the gist of the novelty of his method and the import that his Talmudic scholarship had on the scholarly world. But what I'm going to focus on is more these aspects of his thought about rabbinic literature that generated this theology about how to resolve this tension for the modern Jew, the tension for a Jew committed to halakha, but also interested in the results and conclusions of scholarly research about the development of the Jewish tradition. All right, let's go. I'm gonna interrupt the session for a Q&A period shortly in the middle, and then I'll return to text. But I want to give you a sense of Halivni's background, and I've labeled this section "Learning, Trauma, and More Learning." I gave you a brief sense of his biography before, but we're going to go into some further detail from basically from his memoir about his life. And I want to start. I'm calling this class "The Life and Learning of David Weiss Halivni." I didn't call it "The Life and Teaching" or "The Life and Scholarship," and I use the word "learning" very purposefully, as he did. He wrote in the prefatory comment to the glossary of his memoir, "The Book and the Sword." Throughout this book, the word "learning" is used in a sense slightly different from its common English usage. Learning in this book is similar to the Yiddish "lernen," which is used especially to denote the study of traditional subjects. When one Jew asks another, "What are you learning?" the question means, what text, what traditional text, and what issue are you currently studying? In traditional Jewish circles, one does not study, one learns. That's there. You have, I'm not sure any of us could have met a human being who embodied Yiddishkeit and Jewishness more than David Weiss Halivni. His whole life revolved around his study and love of Torah. And so he used learning very purposefully in his memoir. I therefore use the term with respect to this class. Samuel Heilman in the next text is an Orthodox Jew who was also one of the leading sociologists of the Orthodox yeshiva world. And he wrote a very interesting article called "Lernen, Davenin, and Identifying Orthodox" in the Torah.com, which is a wonderful website. I'll get back to it. The Torah.com is a website that actually tries to advance the causes that Halivni was interested in, the cause of reconciling the conclusions of modern biblical scholarship and a commitment to Jewish tradition and halakha. There's actually the Torah.com, and there's also the Gemara.com. So they want to do the same with respect to rabbinic literature. But the founders of the Torah.com a number of years ago really shared with Halivni this concern about the sources of tension for a contemporary committed Jew. Heilman writes about the yeshiva world, and I thought this was insightful and helpful for our discussion. Lernen, so that's a Yiddish word, which means the traditional Torah study that goes on in a yeshiva, is not learning. And by that word, Heilman means to refer to what goes on in modern secular universities, which is distinguished, meaning in the secular realm, which is distinguished by its imperative to stretch the boundaries of knowledge. Thus, when learning in the secular world, the best question to ask is one that no one has ever asked before, one that challenges received knowledge and brings understandings of that which has remained unknown. Science serves as the paradigm of such learning. Nothing is out of bounds, and even what was accepted as true once can be shown to be false. We know that has been the case in science and the humanities. The same approach is true of the humanities when studied in an academic context, even if the ability to prove the correctness of a new direction is often more difficult, meaning more difficult than it is in the sciences. But in general, and I know that the sort of modern academy sometimes strays from this ideal, this paradigm, but the paradigm in a secular academic context is that all questions are good ones, and wherever those questions leads is where we should end up. The truth has no preconceived boundaries or assumptions. But Heilman writes, but lernen, meaning learning in the yeshiva, traditional yeshiva context, is altogether different. The guiding principle of Lernen was enunciated by the rabbinic sage with the mysterious name Ben Bagbag in Mishnah Avot. So this is from Pirkei Avot. Hafochba v'hafochba decholaba. Turn the Torah over and over, for you will find all in it, meaning all in it already. Of course, part of learning in the yeshiva is to ask questions, and the yeshiva does welcome many questions, but not all. But the point is always, in the end, to prove the pre-existing claims to be correct. The questions are meant to lead to answers that in turn highlight the profound truth of the text. I'm just trying to make the point that in the yeshiva world, you can ask questions, but the discussion asked is always based on the truth and the authority of the Jewish tradition, of either the Torah or the oral law as embodied in rabbinic literature. Certain questions about those traditional texts, I learned when I was growing up and attending an Orthodox Jewish day school, certain questions were not welcome because they defied or potentially defied the assumptions that the discussion was premised on. Lernen in yeshiva has as its goal the redigging of the wells of one's forebears, wells that have been filled in by the ignorance of the ages and by those who have lost their attachment to the well springs of their tradition. The purpose of Lernen is not to discover something new, but rather to uncover pre-existing ideas already expressed in the corpus. All is in it. In Lernen, no statement of the Torah or the rabbis will ever turn out to be false. Lernen, then, as opposed to learning, seeks to enable the devout student to become part of a pre-existing intellectual and spiritual tradition. There is, of course, there are caveats to what Halivni writes here. I think it is generally insightful. The caveats are that the Jewish tradition has always welcomed and encouraged chidushim, novel comments about pre-existing traditional texts. But I think it is true that all discussion within a traditional realm is circumscribed by certain assumptions about the divinity and the sanctity and authority of the texts that are being studied, such that certain questions and certain conclusions about those texts are really out of bounds. This distinction between lernen and learning, I think, is important for Halivni. He grew up in an environment in which he did learning, in which he studied in an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva world. He never lost that ability, but he then transitioned after the Holocaust when he came to the United States, transitioned to a realm that he was not familiar with, to a realm of learning in which scholarship really was able to challenge pre-existing assumptions about the text that he was studying. And he realized he always had that natural inclination within him to the simple sense of a text, to the pshat of a text. And he knew he had always felt a little bit frustrated in the yeshiva world, but I think he couldn't quite understand why. And he discovered that in the world of scholarship, in the world of learning, he could expand on his world of yeshiva learning that he had grown up with. Let's get into some more of the details of his actual life, which really, I think, as you'll see, was incredibly poignant. And he, as I mentioned, his life really embodied some of the most important events and circumstances of the 20th century. So, as I mentioned, he grew up in a broken home, but he was sent to live with his very pious Hasidic grandfather, who was also a rabbinic scholar, but a traditional rabbinic scholar. He was sent to live with his grandfather because his mother did not want him to be influenced by what she thought would be the unfavorable influence of his father. So he grew up in a very traditional household. As time went on, and I acquired knowledge of the Talmud, this is when he was a young boy in Sighet, Romania. The questions persisted and changed accordingly. So he means he had started out studying the Torah, the Chumash and the Tanakh, the 5 books of Moses and the books of the Jewish Bible, and he mastered those pretty quickly. But then he turned to the Talmud at about the age, I think, of about 5 or so. The questions persisted and changed accordingly, not who was whose son, meaning questions about the factual details of the Torah, but how does the 48th page of the Talmud begin? How does it end? And again, this is all from memory. He was being asked questions as a young boy about his knowledge of the Talmud. He was being tested and quizzed. How many times is Rabbi Yosef mentioned in such and such tractate? What does he say the 44th time? And so on. Sometimes, not very often, a person would place a needle on a word in the Talmud and ask, what is written at this spot on the pages beneath? I'll say this now, but my impression of Professor Halivni was that I only realize this now in retrospect, that he was sort of a human version of Chat GPT. He seemed to have, he did essentially have the entire universe of rabbinic literature in his mind at the same time, and really of many texts beyond. He grew up in a Hasidic home, so he was also exposed to Kabbalistic and mystical and Hasidic literature. He really had all of traditional Jewish texts at his disposal in his mind, and he could apply, he was able eventually, when he came to the United States, to apply his incredible genius to those traditional texts to arrive at conclusions that were very novel and not traditional. But simply to have all of rabbinic literature in his mind at the same time, as if he were a computer, was amazing to behold. He writes in his memoir that he doesn't think he had a photographic memory. Almost everyone who met him attributes to him a photographic memory, so I'm not sure why he thought he didn't have one, but it was quite impressive. He continues, I recall that I once came to Vesheva, the hometown of my future wife, Tzipora. By the way, she was also a professor. She came from a very important family of a dynasty of Hasidic rabbis. So he was really born into a Hasidic family, married a woman who was herself a product of the Hasidic world. But as you'll see, he rejected the Hasidic aspect of the Orthodox world. But he writes, I recall that I once came to the hometown of his future wife and met a Mr. Jacobowitz who was engaged in the lumber business. He told me that he would give me 50 lei, a considerable sum, if I told him the 64th statement of Rabbah, the famous Talmudic sage in tractate Bava Metzia. By the way, all of these stories in his memoir from his time in Europe are before he turned 17 or 18 when he arrived in the United States. So as a teenager. I told him, so Halivni gave this man the answer, and then stretched out my hand expecting him to give me the money. He looked at me and said, how do I know that you gave me the right answer? Halivni acknowledges it was a logical objection, because of course this man who was engaged in lumber business had no idea if Halivni was giving him the correct answer. But of course I could not leave it at that. So I said, well, if I tell you the 20th, the 25th, the 40th, and so on, will you give me the money? In this same vein, at the age of 9, I learned by heart 200 dapim, and for those of you familiar with Talmudic study, a daf is really a two-sided page, so as you'll see, it says 400 pages, and I calculated that that's about 7.5% of the entire Talmud. So he learned by heart 400 pages of Talmud at the age of 9, with Rashi's commentary and that of his disciples, the Tosafot, the Tosafists, and for this received a prize provided by the Forreston family of Boston. Again, this is while he was living in Europe pre-Holocaust, which was enough to support the whole family for a week or two. He took not only great pride in his Jewish learning, but in his memoir, he indicates he took great pride in helping to support his family. His family was quite poor, and he was sort of the pride of the community and often generated some income for the family as a result. By the way, we'll get back to this, but for those of you unfamiliar with the study of Talmud, it is very challenging for the smartest among us. It has, if you're not familiar with the text, it has no punctuation. It's written in Aramaic. It is full of dialectical, argumentative discussion that is difficult to follow and decipher. The Tosafists that he mentioned are notoriously difficult to understand, and they are the subject matter. When I was in my graduate program, I was I had to learn how to study Tosafot well, and it was a huge challenge for me. And Halivni is saying that at age 9, he had memorized 400 pages of Talmud along with all of those commentaries and could answer arcane, kind of ridiculous, trivial questions of the sort referenced here. he writes, and I mentioned this, but he writes, even though I was born among Hasidim, literally in the Polzhiner Rebbe's house, lived among Hasidim, if there were mitnagdim, religious Jews who were not Hasidim in Siget, I did not know them. So he grew up in a world of Hasidim and was exposed to constant telling and retelling by grandfather. That's his mentor of his pre-Holocaust world, of the wondrous deeds of the Belzer Rebbe's. I was never a real Hasid, even when I was living in Siget. What I have retained from Hasidut to this day is the enthusiasm and intensity of prayer. As far back as I can remember, I was distanced by the intellectual limitations of Hasidism, missing S, at first mistakenly thinking that they among religious Jews were the only ones who opposed the study of secular subjects. Later, I met mitnagdim who were no less fiercely opposed to secular knowledge. But above all, and this is why he had problems with Hasidut, others don't, but this was his personal reaction. But above all, I had difficulty accepting the concept of the tzaddik, the leader who is endowed with superhuman qualities that give him access to the divine not available to ordinary mortals. By the way, for many of us who met Halivni, we attributed to him superhuman qualities. The concept is a cornerstone of Hasidut, of Hasidism. I had difficulty, not so much in principle as in practice. That means he had problems finding people with such qualities. And then he continues in an important insight about him that's why I'm including this. My reluctance to attribute superhuman qualities to the Hasidic Rebbe's may also be partially responsible for my having adopted the critical method in my study of the Talmud. By critical method, he means his what came to be his non-traditional method in studying Talmud. The critical method is less credulous, less believing of the present available text, finds fault with it, and looks for a more credible and accurate text. Critical scholarship does not suffer hagiography, the veneration of sort of saints, for while it is willing to concede that the hero was a superior human being, it is not willing to declare him superhuman, free of faults and mistakes. And I think that approach to Hasidic Rebbe's of Halivni really also migrated to his study of Jewish texts. Any Jewish text in front of him, if he felt there was something awry with the text, he was willing to consider whether there was something either defective about the text or the tradition of transmission through which it has arrived in our hands. And we'll get back to all of those issues. I include a couple of texts from his memoir about the Holocaust. Again, his memoir really uniquely among all of his writings focuses on his life before, during, and after this trauma and how it affected his life, his thought about God, his thought about the world. And here in his memoir, he cites a rabbinic agadah from the Talmud. When the Holy One, blessed be he, calls to mind his children who were plunged in suffering among the nations of the world. By his children, the Talmud is referring to Jews. God lets fall 2 tears into the ocean, and the sound is heard from one end of the world to the other. And that is the rumbling of the earth. Meaning when God cries over the suffering of Jews, the Talmud tells us that causes the sound of earthquakes that we hear. When we hear an earthquake, it's really God crying over the suffering of Jews in the world. And then he writes, to the best of my knowledge, seismologists recorded no disturbances in the vicinity of Siget, where he was growing up, on March 19, 1944. But if earthquakes are caused by the sufferings of Jews at the hands of other nations, then there ought to have been dreadful tremors on that beautiful, crisp, early spring morning, when a neighbor knocked at our door, telling us that the Germans had occupied Hungary. We depended on this neighbor for news, because she had a radio and we could not afford one. I closed the Gemara, the Talmud I was learning, and I did not open it again until the end of 1945. So after he was liberated from the labor camp in which he ended up. But his reaction to the Holocaust is one that we'll get back to. Halivni eventually wrote that there were 2 great dispositive revelations in Jewish history. One was the revelation by God to the Jews, to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, the revelation of the Torah. I mean, he was a believer to the end of his life in divine revelation. So that was the first great revelation. And the second revelation, it turns out, in retrospect, was the revelation of God's presence at Mount Sinai, and the second is the revelation of God's absence during the Holocaust. And we'll see it's more than just God's withdrawal from the world in a traditional sense of Hester Panim, that God's face was hidden from us. But Halivni believes that really sort of in an ontological, actual sense, God withdrew from the world and allowed for this terrible suffering. Halivni doesn't really forgive God for that. And we'll see that it affected his reaction, but again, not his piety. His piety was seemingly unfazed by the traumas of the Holocaust, in which his entire family was slaughtered. He writes about his time at first at Auschwitz and then at 2 labor camps. This is a well-known story that I wanted to include. So he's referring to a Nazi guard at the Wolfsburg labor camp, in which he found himself as a teenager, again alone. He didn't have any family members with him. This Nazi guard sandwich, he noticed, was wrapped in a page of the Orach Chaim, a volume of the Shulchan Aruch. That's the great 16th century code of Jewish law by Rabbi Yosef Karo. That is the definitive code of Jewish law from the medieval period. And Halivni, in his great knowledge of rabbinic literature, could tell that this guard sandwich had a page of the Shulchan Aruch wrapped around it, and not just any page, but Halivni wants to give us his, not just his knowledge of, but his great love and attachment to any traditional Jewish text, that this was Pesel Balaban's edition. And then he goes on to say, tell us what he knew about them. The Balabans began publishing the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law, in Lemberg in 1839. The first publisher was Abraham Balaban, and after his death, he was succeeded by his widow Pesel. Pessel's edition of the Shulchan Aruch was the best. It had all the commentaries, including that of Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. As a child of a poor but scholarly home, I had always wanted to have her edition. We had a Shulchan Aruch, but it wasn't Pessel's. Ours was also old and torn. It was my ambition as a child, and he means as a real child, to own a Vilna Shas, a complete set of all the Talmud's volumes, Pesel Shulchan Aruch, and a set of Rambams, as he calls it, or as he called it, a complete set of Maimonides' major legal writings. Here, of all places, in the shadows of the tunnel that that Halivni and the other Jewish slave laborers were building, the Nazis were hiding their munitions underground from the Allied bombing. Here, of all places, in the shadows of the tunnel, under the threatening gaze of the Nazi guard, a page of the Shulchan Aruch with fatty spots all over it from the sandwich met my eyes. The page was from the laws of Passover. Halivni could look at this page around a sandwich and immediately know what it was discussing. The question on the page deals with whether an agent can nullify the leavened bread of a household before Passover, which is the subject of a disagreement. He then, in the memoir, continues, but I left it at that. But Halivni could look at a page of rabbinic literature wrapped around a Nazi guard sandwich and know exactly what the text was about. Upon seeing this wrapper, I instinctively fell at the feet of the guard without even realizing why. The mere letters propelled me. With tears in my eyes, I implored him to give me this bletzel, this page. For a while, he didn't know what was happening. He thought I was suffering from epilepsy. He immediately put his hand to his revolver, the usual reaction to an unknown situation. But then he understood. This was, I explained to him, a page from a book I had studied at home. Please, I sobbed, give it to me as a souvenir. He gave me the bletzel and I took it back to the camp, to the labor camp, to the other Jews. On the Sundays we had off, we had not only oral Torah, but written Torah as well, meaning he was teaching, along with other rabbis who may have been in the camp, teaching Torah by heart. They had no written text they could use, but here was a single detached page from the Shulchan Aruch, that written Torah, and he doesn't mean in the traditional sense of the 5 books of Moses, but he means actual Torah down in writing on a piece of paper. The bletzel became a visible symbol of a connection between the camp and the activities of Jews throughout history. It was not important what the bletzel topic was, whether agency or any other. Perhaps it was symbolic. Who knows what mission we were supposed to fulfill there? The Bletzel became a rallying point. We looked forward to studying it whenever we had time, more so even than to the single set of tefillin. They had one set of tefillin in camp that they hid and they passed around so that they could pray, they could daven with tefillin on. It was the Bletzel, parts of which had to be deciphered because the grease made some letters illegible, that summoned our attention. Most of those, meaning his Jews, fellow Jews in the camp, who came to listen didn't understand the subject matter, but that was irrelevant. They all perceived the symbolic significance of the Bletzel. So I just wanted to include a couple of excerpts about his experience during the Holocaust, which, thank God, he survived. But he writes in his memoir and then in another of his books about his reaction, his theological reaction to the Holocaust. And he writes in the memoir, of the four things I have named, he named four things that he flatly rejects about theories sort of about the Holocaust. And I wanted to include this last one. Let me speak first of the one that I reject with derision. This is the one that he rejects with the most passion. The attempt to make theological excuses for the Holocaust. I consider it obscene to assume that the Shoah, the Holocaust, took place, especially since it came from Germany, as a divine response to the spread of the German culture of Haskalah, or secularism, and then I added, or Jewish enlightenment, among the Jews. So there were some in the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox community who said, oh, the Holocaust occurred because Jews sinned, because Jews became secular, because of the spread of Haskalah, of Jewish enlightenment in Europe. That's why God punished the Jews. First of all, these apologies, Halivni writes, are historically absurd. Germany had the most secular Jews, and yet more Jews of other nationalities were exterminated. But most important, and I think this is really important, I've touched on this position in some prior classes, but most important, these rationalizations are theologically offensive. The phrase, for our sins we were exiled, the Hebrew is, I've added, mipnei chatainu galinu me'artzenu. That is a phrase that we continue to sing at Or Zaru and many other, and most other shuls around the world. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land, which essentially blames the Jews themselves for their historical misfortunes. That's a very traditional Jewish theme and trope. That phrase, Halivni writes, has a legitimate place in our tradition and liturgy, but dispersion, so that the fact that our sins led to our exile from Israel to the diaspora, even with its attendant sufferings, is one thing, and vast annihilation of man, woman, and child is another. To say to people whom we know, because of our sins, we were sent to Auschwitz, this must be rejected out of hand. There are certain times in history when justification almost smacks of participation. A justification, by definition, means it should have happened. It's justice. It's the fitting course of events. People who make such statements suggest, in effect, that had it not happened, they would have worked to bring it about. Even aside from the historical absurdity, sensitive human beings must consider this abominable. So he totally rejects any theological justifications for the Holocaust. He believes it was a time of divine sort of absenteeism from the world, but not attributable to Jewish sinfulness or Jewish misconduct. I want to end this little section with just a sense of his life after the Holocaust. So his memoir includes his life before, growing up in Romania, during the Holocaust, and afterwards when he came to the United States. So this is, he was the lone survivor of his family. He ended up in an orphanage in the Bronx. So he was brought to the United States, and he ended up in a Bronx Jewish orphanage. But this is another famous story. He refused to eat the meat in this Jewish orphanage because he didn't trust the kashrut. He didn't trust that the meat was kosher. And again, remember, he was about 17 or 18. He's already been a rabbi for a couple of years, since the age of 15. The next morning, after he had refused to eat the meat, so this is in 1947. He was born, by the way, in September of 1927. Halivni was in the orphanage. And it turns out that the social worker who was working in the orphanage was herself from an important family, and she was the sister-in-law of the great Professor Saul Lieberman, who was older than Halivni, at JTS, and at one time, Saul Lieberman, and whenever, as a graduate student after he had died, I always referred to him as Saul Lieberman Zal. That's how I heard everyone else refer to him. He was revered at JTS and was really, in a sense, Halivni's Talmudic mentor once Halivni arrived at JTS. And this social worker was Professor Lieberman's sister-in-law and really changed Halivni's life. She took Halivni to Professor Lieberman's house. I was enormously impressed by Lieberman's erudition, which is probably unrivaled by that of any living scholar. Even when he didn't want to impress, he was impressive. From this first long discussion with Professor Lieberman recognized Halivni's genius and that he was dealing with a very young but brilliant Talmudic scholar. From this first long discussion with Professor Lieberman that day concerning Talmudic subjects, I remember only one Tosafot. Those are the medieval commentaries that are very challenging that I mentioned earlier. A passage of medieval commentary on the Babylonian Talmud on tractate Chulin, which deals with kashrut and ritual slaughter, in which I had the upper hand, meaning over Lieberman, because I remembered it better than he did, probably because Halivni had studied it more recently. At the time, he did not say anything. But as I left, when I was already at the door and turned back to thank him again, I noticed that Lieberman had taken out the Chulin, the tractate folio of the Talmud, turned to the first page and begun to study. I asked him, "Why are you studying Chulin?" And he answered, "If I forgot one Tosafot, one medieval commentary on this tractate, who knows how many others I may also have forgotten." And Halivni concludes that paragraph, "Erudition, including his own, Halivni's own, is a steady endeavor." This first casual meeting with Professor Lieberman may have changed the course of my life, given the perception of JTS in yeshiva circles. And recall at the time, after Halivni was brought to America, he was housed in an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva. He studied at an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva in Brooklyn. Because of his advanced rabbinic knowledge, he was given permission not to attend lectures and just basically study Torah and Talmud. And JTS, as the conservative rabbinical school, was not respected, was not esteemed in those yeshiva circles. So given that perception of JTS, and Halivni was in the yeshiva world at the time, I doubt very much that I would ever have gone to the seminary had I not first met Professor Lieberman, and had I not been so impressed by his enormous scholarly capabilities and by what I took at the time to be a simple, almost naive religiosity. Had I not eventually gone to the seminary, I doubt very much if, despite my native inclination toward Pshat, so he always had a natural inclination to accept, to adopt the contextual, simple, straightforward reading of both biblical passages and Talmudic passages, toward the simple meaning of texts unencumbered by tortuous interpretations. So he's saying if he had not gone to JTS, he doubts, despite his native inclination toward Pshat, that he would have developed into a full-fledged Talmudic scholar dedicated to the scientific critical method. So he doubts, if it had not been for this sort of in his doubting the kashrut, doubting the kosher status of the meat in the orphanage. And by the way, the memoir, I'll just fill in a gap, a detail about the story in the memoir. The mashgiach, the kosher kashrut supervisor of the Bronx orphanage, was an ultra-Orthodox young rabbi. But Halivni questioned him, as Halivni again was 18 or so, questioned him about some issue relating to kashrut, relating to the commentary in the Shulchan Aruch, and the young ultra-Orthodox rabbi could not answer the question. That led Halivni to doubt the kashrut of the orphanage. But had it not been for that sort of chance incident, and that the social worker had not been the sister-in-law of Professor Saul Lieberman at JTS, Halivni's life may have ended up quite different, because again at the time he was immersed in the traditional yeshiva world, but he was introduced through Lieberman to a different kind of study of Talmud. I want to end this section, then I'll open it up for some questions, if any. I want to give you some sense. I've said that he was a giant of Torah learning. I want to give you some sense of what is his greatest contribution to Torah scholarship in the 20th century, which was the novelty and creative genius of his scholarship about the Talmud. But what we're going to focus on in these class sessions is really his theology about the interaction of rabbinic literature and the Torah. So I'm going to I'm going to give you a sense of, but we're not going to really be able to delve into the details of his Talmudic scholarship per se. But I want to give you a sense of this. His great Talmudic commentary, his magnum opus. He wanted to write a commentary on every tractate of the Talmud. He died at the age of 94 before he was able to complete the entire Babylonian Talmud. He got through most of it. But the introduction to one of the volumes of his magnum opus, Mekorotim Sorot, was translated by Jeffrey Rubenstein, who was now a very highly respected professor of Jewish studies at NYU. And Jeff was finishing his PhD in the religion department at Columbia University with Halivni as I was starting mine. So he was sort of my senior colleague. I didn't get to know him well, but he was another of Halivni's students, older than me, and has become one of Halivni's most accomplished students. And he translated Halivni's this important introduction about Halivni's scholarship, and I wanted to include this excerpt. The formation of the Babylonian Talmud, so that's the name given to Halivni's historical outline of the development of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. The formation of the Babylonian Talmud, Halivni's work, is a monumental achievement. The summation of a lifetime of study and scholarship, it is the only comprehensive account of the processes that produced the Babylonian Talmud, written in nearly a century, and probably the most inclusive and complete ever, means ever in history. Even a brief glance at the contents, the table of contents, provides a sense of the tremendous scope of this undertaking. The reluctance, so meaning the reluctance prior to Halivni, to attempt vast and synthetic histories of the Babylonian Talmud, such as Halivni attempted, is certainly understandable in light of the formidable challenges entailed. To do so, as Halivni ended up doing, requires proficiency in the Sea of Talmud in all its length and breadth, its thousands of folios, the variant manuscript traditions, the interrelationships and intertextual connections between its myriads of passages. One must possess exhaustive knowledge of parallel and related passages in the Mishnah, which is the 2nd century definitive Jewish law code that was edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in Palestine at the time. The Tosefta, which was a contemporaneous document to the Mishnah, but includes passages from those Tanaim, those rabbinic sages in the 1st and 2nd centuries that was not included in the Mishnah. The Yerushalmi, which is the Palestinian Talmud. Halachic and Agadic Midrashim, which are numerous compilations of rabbinic interpretations and exegesis of the Torah, and in the complete corpus of rabbinic literature with which to compare Bavli traditions so as to reconstruct their development and metamorphoses. A scholar must command the entire post-Talmudic tradition in all its branches and genres, the halachic codes of the Geonim, those were the leaders of the Babylonian academies in the 6th to 11th centuries. Responsa, those are the answers that rabbis gave through time to questions about Jewish law posed by Jewish communities around the world. The medieval and early modern commentaries and historiographical writings across the generations. And one needs, so you need to have all of that at your disposal, but you also have to be very creative. And one needs the intellectual acumen to master the complexities of the Bavli's dialectical argumentation, to discern the incongruities and inconsistencies in the intricate sequences of nested objections and responses that constitute the signs of textual development and editing. And we'll get back to this, but that was Halivni's genius. He was so facile with the Talmud that he had an intuition about where the text of the Talmud had sort of gone awry, and where the sources, meaning the ancient sources, had been corrupted in the course, or misunderstood in the course of transmission. And Professor Rubenstein continues about Halivni: through consummate mastery of the Talmud in its entirety, together with all of rabbinic literature, and by considering the intertextual relationships among all relevant passages, Halivni ventures to answer questions that have proved intractable for generations of scholars. It is safe to say that for the foreseeable future, the formation of the Babylonian Talmud will be the definitive account of the Babylonian Talmud and the foundation for all critical Talmudic study. Okay, so we're only partway through my source sheet, but I'm going to stop there. welcome any questions or comments based on what we've already discussed. And again, we're going to go back to all of these issues and to parts of his life as we continue. I see Charlie, yes.
Yeah, well, first of all, his life is an amazing example of the triumph of the human spirit. Coming from the Holocaust, being thrown into an unknown land, having to learn a language and rising in scholarship in an area, in a field where he actually questions the role of God in modern human history. It's an amazing thing. It's just his psychology and his dedication to the field is beyond my own understanding. But beyond that, he questions God's role. My summary would be he questions God's role in modern human history, modern Jewish history. He doesn't accept that God's tears hit the earth when the Holocaust happened, certainly not in Transylvania where he came from. What does he think about the prophets? I'm kind of thinking he accepts God's role in human endeavor, human history during the history that's recorded in the Torah. But then we go into post-Torah times and we go to the prophets.
Yeah, Charlie, let me stop you there. I get the gist of your question, but let me be clear. He believed that God was exempt or absent from history only during the Holocaust. He believed Halivni was a very strong believer in the presence of and our sort of access to God's revelation during the time of the Torah, and he believed strongly in God's presence in history, in all but the years of the Holocaust. So I don't mean to generalize anything about Halivni's belief in the involvement of God in the world, other than during the horrible trauma of the years of the Holocaust. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
And for that, basically one of the points there is he never forgave God.
No. I made some comment to that, but he didn't forgive God for the suffering we suffered during the Holocaust. But till his dying day, Halivni davened 3 times a day.
That's
believed
clear.
in God, and so when I interacted with him, he seemed he didn't carry with him the weight of the Holocaust. I want to get back to your initial comments. He was, I agree with you, he was an incredible example and illustration of human resilience. If you didn't know that he was a Holocaust survivor, I believe one who encountered him in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and through the last years of life, one really wouldn't know that he had endured the trauma of the Holocaust. As I mentioned, he was generally an upbeat man. He smiled a lot. He had a good sense of humor. He did not seem oppressed by the weight of the Holocaust, but he had feelings about what the Jewish people had suffered during the Holocaust. But that was not his sort of predominant theology. He was still an incredibly committed, passionate believer in God's interaction with the world and our ability to try to understand God's will. That was what his entire world, his entire life was dedicated to, trying to explicate Torah. He believed the Torah embodied God's will, and that it was our job to try to understand it. So the Holocaust was almost like a footnote in his overall theology, a tremendously traumatic footnote, but it did not come to dominate his sense of his perspective on the world, and certainly did not dominate his personality and his temperament.
It's an amazing model to follow of how to move forward after.
Yes, I believe it is.
Tragedies are undescribable.
I believe it is. Anyone else? You may have to raise your hands, or I can't see everyone. Yes, Hal.
I was just following up Charlie's question just about theodicy in general. I understand he thought that God withdrew from the Holocaust experience, but what about the numerous other situations where it seemed that the Jews are unnecessarily or unimaginably persecuted?
It's a good question, Hal. We'll get back to this, but I think he distinguished in quality the suffering that we endured during the Holocaust. He may or may not have been open to traditional Jewish notions of what he referred to earlier, this mipnei chata'enu, because of our sins we were punished. Maybe he was open to that with respect to prior sufferings, but I think he thought the Holocaust was just on a different magnitude of trauma that was inexplicable with reference to that traditional Jewish conception. So he was able to live more comfortably with prior sufferings, although he was perfectly familiar with all of that and wished that we had suffered none of it. But he viewed the Holocaust as different in kind. Ira, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. All right, well, Ira, we can correspond separately. Yes,
How about
Bobby.
now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Ira.
Okay. The tension between the drash and the peshat, but aren't there four different things? And what would he say about all four of them?
Well, there's certain commentators say there are four. It's not like there are just dispositively or definitively four ways of approaching Jewish text. His focus was on those two, and to the extent that there are two others, I think he would incorporate those within what he is calling drash, so that you have the plain sense of a text, and then you basically have any other way of interpreting it that seems disconnected from the plain, straightforward sense of the verse. Again, either a biblical verse or a Talmudic passage, however you want to describe that. In whatever sort of philosophical or mystical way you want to describe it, if it is disengaged and it's not directly connected to what he believed the pshat of a verse is, he wanted to understand why. Why was there that gap? And he understood that certain thinkers were not interested in the pshat. They wanted to create midrash that went beyond the plain sense of a verse. But what he was focused on, Ira, was midrash halacha, the exegesis, the interpretation of the rabbis that generated Jewish law. So he knew, of course, he knew all of the rabbinic agadot that are reflected in the stories that are reflected in rabbinic literature. And one of my colleagues from my graduate program, Marjorie Lehman, who's spoken at Or before, and is one of Halivni's, she was a colleague of mine under Halivni. Her focus is Agadah. But Halivni himself was focused on the Jewish legal aspects of rabbinic literature. So that's what agitated him when Jewish law seemed to be predicated on interpretations that seemed disengaged, disconnected from the plain sense of Torah.
Yep.
Yes, Bobby.
So I'm wondering, did he find a place that was more satisfying for him in academia? Where did he eventually, or did he ever eventually come to find this kind of satisfaction of continued kavanah and dedication to Jewish spiritualism, and also the more enlightened sense of modern thinking in terms of information?
Excellent question, Bobby, and it will allow me to give a little bit more insight into his life. So I think the short answer is, I don't think he ever found a single forum in which he felt perfect harmony. And that's why I think in his memoirs, he writes, he felt he achieved a certain amount of harmony. And I believe that it was always, it was partial, almost complete, but not fully complete. He felt at home, the longer answer is he felt at home in different ways in different places. So he writes in his memoir that he is completely fine being associated with people who are religiously observant to the most stringent decree. He has no problems with people being very stringent in their commitment to Jewish law. So he's perfectly comfortable in sort of that yeshiva world, but he found that world uncomfortable from an intellectual standpoint. He very much enjoyed his time at JTS. He was there with other scholars who shared his commitment to the pursuit of truth about Jewish tradition and Jewish texts. But he eventually came to find, and we'll get back to this, came to find JTS, as he wrote, religiously wanting with respect to what he thought should be a rigorous commitment to Jewish law and to halakha. He was, by the way, we will discuss this, but he was most concerned with respect to the ordination of women question, not with respect to the ultimate result. I think he believed in principle in the ordination of women. He took objection to what the decision-making process was at JTS, and we'll get back to that. As a result, by the way, he founded his own rabbinical school. We'll see, I have a text from it, it's called the Union for Traditional Judaism. It was really a group of conservative rabbis who thought JTS had moved to the left a little bit too much, and Halivni became their sort of the dean of their rabbinic institution. But he moved from JTS because of that issue to Columbia. That's where I encountered him. He was very happy at Columbia from a scholarly perspective. I saw that he enjoyed his interactions with both his Jewish colleagues and his non-Jewish colleagues. I was in the religion department with him. Most of the professors were non-Jews, obviously studying other religions. And I could see that Halivni really reveled in the diversity of his interactions. But he davened with a certain traditional crowd. It was really the traditional Jewish crowd, what used to be called the Finkelstein Minyan, that was headed by Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of JTS at a time. When Chancellor Finkelstein became ill, Halivni eventually became the head of that minyan. So his religious and his intellectual lives were a little, as I mentioned, a little bit bifurcated. When he decided to make Aliyah, and really retire in Israel in his 70s, he ended up teaching Talmud to other Talmud professors at both Bar Ilan and Hebrew University. So he had well-attended class sessions that Israeli scholars were attending in Halivni's latter years. He was, and I'll finish by saying, and these are all, I think useful points to convey. His greatest love was Talmud Torah. His greatest love was learning Torah, not just learning it, but teaching it. And that his whole purpose in life was to convey to other people the grandeur and greatness and divinity of the Torah and Talmud, even though he reached, revolutionary conclusions about some of these texts. His desire was always to recover, as he put it, the sort of glory of the Jewish textual heritage that we've inherited.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Anyone else? Okay. I know that it is getting late. I'm just going to share a couple of other. Actually, I see it's 11:27. We're going to stop there, and I hope I've given you some sense of the import of David Weiss Halivni, not just as a Jewish scholar. He was enormously influential and important, and we will talk about his scholarly contributions, but a sense of his life that really spanned, the great and grotesque circumstances of the 20th century for Jews. His life was, I think, one of the most important Jewish lives of the 20th century, or really of the modern period. And I think his legacy and his contributions will be felt, for, I hope, for generations to come. So we will get into the details of his thought about the Torah, about the rabbinic tradition, about the interaction of the Torah and the rabbinic tradition, which generated, again, I think, is quite novel theology about how one can reconcile, on the one hand, a pristine attachment to pursuit of truth in an academic sense about Jewish history and Jewish texts, and on the other, maintain and preserve a deep, pious, genuine commitment to Jewish tradition on the other. So I hope you come back for the second and third sessions next Sunday morning, and we'll get into some further details of Halivni's life and learning. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you back. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have
Mark.
a-
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay.
Be well. Take care.